Can everyone hear me okay with this microphone on? Okay, cool. I'll get started in a minute. So, hi everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Tom. I'm a lecturer in psychology in the department here. This is my colleague, Dr Emily Nicholls from Sociology. And today we're going to be giving you a lecture about the psychology of eating meat and also the psychology of not eating meat. How it's going to work is I'm going to do the first portion of the lecture and then Emily's going to come in and do the second portion. At the start, for those of you who are students and staff, you'll be familiar with this. Also, I should apologise, I have quite a sore throat, so I'm going to do my best not to cough in front of you all, but I may do a little bit. So for students and staff, you'll be familiar with this thing called Menti. Menti, for those of you who aren't familiar with this is a polling software. It's basically a way that I can interact with you and you can ask questions to me and I can ask questions to you. And you can just use your phone, just needs an internet connection. So that's what we're going to do first of all. So if everyone can please whip out their phone and just type in, if you haven't used it before, I'll talk you through it. You just type in menti.com, just like that. And what it's going to do, it's going to ask you for a number to input that will take you to a few questions that I've got for you. And the number that you input into the poll, once that moves away, is this number here, 23585329. So just to get an indication of what sort of audience we have, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions at the start. I just want to know, what are people's diets? I should say all of this is all anonymous as well. We don't have any idea who is answering what. We're interested to know what your diet is at the moment. So again, just for those who haven't used this before, if you just go to menti.com, menti.com, and then type in this code here, 23585329, that will bring you to this poll and you can answer these questions as we go. So it looks like we've got 50 people who have answered, so this is good. This is probably about, we might have a little bit more in the room, but that's pretty good answering. So what we can see here is that we have a whole range of people coming from a whole range of different perspectives, of a whole range of different diets, which is really awesome. So it's really nice to see we have a whole range of people from vegans, vegetarians, all through to people who are pescatarian, and also people who eat meat. So this is very good. So everyone is welcome. I'm just interested, this is the final question just for warm-up. I'm just interested, you probably already filled this out, but just to know out of those who actually came to the lecture today, are you a member of the public, university staff, or university student, just so that we can get an idea of who's in the room? Okay, so we have quite a lot of students. This is actually quite encouraging to see, students turning up to a non-compulsory lecture in the evening. This is very, very good. Yeah, I wish you'd come to the ones during the day, but that's all right. We also have a range of university staff. Welcome, I see some colleagues from the department, lovely to see you. And if I may say, probably a more wonderful number to see is 14 people from the public, which I'm very, very welcome and very, very nice to see you. And thanks very much for coming. It's very cool. This is the first public lecture I've done in the department here, so it's very, very encouraging to see some people who are not from the university, whoever you may be, so thank you very much for coming. So to start off today, I probably should consider just briefly the question of whether or not or why we should be thinking about this topic of eating meat and animals, and why is it an important question, and is it an important question? So I've got up here, are animals worthy of moral concern? There's a few prompting questions that a lot of people might be thinking about in this room, but also questions that researchers have been thinking about and discussing for a while as well. So should we care about animals? Is it bad if we harm or kill animals? How would we know whether an animal is morally relevant? So when I use the word morally, what I'm really just talking about is, do we think it's right or wrong to do something? I've got here a picture of Dr. Stephen Best, who's a philosopher in America, who's very influential to me in first thinking deeply about animals. And so if anyone is interested in this philosophical side of human-animal relations, I encourage you to have a look at some of Stephen Best's work. He does a lot. He's put a lot of videos on YouTube, so you can just type in Stephen Best's name on YouTube, and you'll see a bit about him. So, to answer these questions, we do briefly need to consider what moral philosophy has to say about this topic. And the short answer of it is that for me, yes, animals are worthy of moral concern. And the reason why that is because they're sentient, that they can feel pain and that they can feel pleasure. But it's because they're sentient, it's because of their ability to feel pain and pleasure that we should include them in discussions and lectures on morality and whether or not it's right or wrong to harm them. So now I'm going to start talking a little bit about what sort of animals we do eat in the UK. So we eat actually a very restricted number of species, and not just in the UK, but in the West. And we pretty much limit, people who eat meat pretty much limit themselves to these animals: chickens, pigs, cows, sheep, and fish. And the reason for this really is basically that these animals can be bred in large numbers and they don't really attack each other, then they can be quite docile. They've been bred for docility. So you can keep them in large numbers and they won't harm each other by and large. And they also don't harm people, and that's a big sort of reason. Obviously, it's quite possible that lions perhaps taste quite nice. Most people don't know that because lions would be pretty creative to try and herd lions and try to keep a whole bunch of lions together. And so it's for these very kind of basic kind of reasons of like what's kind of practical to keep a whole lot of animals together. That's really why these animals have been farmed. And these are the same sorts of animals that have been farmed for thousands of years all throughout history. It's pretty consistent. But what about eating dogs? There's lots of dogs around in the UK, quite a lot of dogs. We could eat dogs. They have meat just like many other animals. And we can think about whether or not we would or wouldn't eat dogs. And so for those meat eaters in the room, I've got a rhetorical question. I'm not actually asking you to put your hand up and answer, but I just want you to think about it. If you are a meat eater, would you consider eating dog meat? This is the results of a poll of 6,500 British adults. And when they were asked this question of would they consider eating dog meat, this is what they said. As you can see, most people, the vast majority of people, said they definitely would not. There's 1% said that they definitely would, and there's a few percent that said they might do. So we can say that there's a few percent, up between 1 and 5% of people that might consider eating dog meat, but by and large, most people in the UK, and most people in the West really, and perhaps even in the world, wouldn't actually eat dog meat, even though they eat other animals. And that's actually really interesting if we can pause and think about why that is. If you are a meat eater, and if I was just posing this question as I did, it's quite possible that for many of you, you got some sort of feelings of disgust or some sort of feelings of revulsion to eating these animals. And this is really useful because it sort of illustrates what a lot of vegetarians and vegans feel when asked and when thinking about eating other animals as well. It's quite similar. And so this sort of repulsion, this sort of disgust, these feelings that arise when we think about harming animals and eating animals, this is going to come up a little bit throughout the lecture later on. A big topic in the psychology of eating meat is what's called the meat paradox. So paradox really refers to something that's inconsistent, and the meat paradox refers to the idea that for many people, eating meat is paradoxical because most people like animals and love animals, and most people have pets and they go to zoos and we like seeing animals, and if we see a cat in the street, we typically don't instinctively think to go and kill it and harm it. Typically, even meat eaters, when they see animals out in the streets, their first instinct is to usually show it some affection and pet it and sort of want to look after it. So for most people, we typically want to like and look after and care for and even love animals. But at the same time, if we eat meat, it requires other people, usually on our behalf, to kill those animals and butcher those animals to create the meat to eat. The other side of it, and this is where this talk sort of relates to this week's Sustainability Week at the university, is that there's quite a good amount of research looking at the environmental costs of eating meat, but also animal products more broadly, but particularly eating meat. And so eating meat has been associated with a lot of environmental destruction and environmental impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so we could summarize this by saying that for most people, eating meat is paradoxical because it requires, if you want to get meat and eat meat, it requires killing animals and it requires harming the environment. Now, some people don't care about either of those things, and for those people, it's not paradoxical, but that quite a small percentage of the population we're talking about. For the vast majority of people who eat meat, they're typically kind to other animals, which is also why I think the topic is really interesting, that the ways that we treat animals in society, it shows the breadth of like the best and the worst of humans, I think. That we typically, in the UK, for example, some like dogs and cats are looked after in general so well. There's no, for example, in the UK, there's no stray dog population because dogs is treated with so much care. And if there is a stray dog, even people who don't have a dog themselves will go and try and find the owner, look after it, call up RSPCA, what have you. So we have like really, really kind, compassionate consideration for some animals, but then for other animals, we treat them in a very, very violent kind of way. And so this just kind of interests me that we do this. And this is hopefully interesting for you as well, which is why you came here. So this is from a website called Vegan Sidekick. It has some interesting cartoons about veganism and like harming animals. So if you're interested in any of these cartoons, you're welcome to check them out. So I said that to get meat, you have to raise and kill a lot of animals. And so the reason I got this picture here is because I think it illustrates the production, what goes on behind the scenes quite well. So at the top of the picture is a joke about a fruit abattoir, right? That people can go and pick their own vegetables, or sometimes you can go and pick your own fruit, like berries and stuff like that. And it's seen as like quite a nice thing to do. You can see how the plants are grown, how the strawberries are grown. You can go and pick your own strawberries, and some people like that. The same can't be said for the production of animal products. The production of animal products, particularly when you're getting close to the slaughtering, so just before the slaughtering and the butchering of animals, it's very concealed. It's very hidden from society on purpose. If anyone who has been to a slaughterhouse, you'll know that there's cameras all around, there's security, it's kind of hard to get in. People who go in and investigate these places and film and document these places can be met with extremely harsh punishments from the law when they do this. So as part of my research during my time in Edinburgh, I went to a slaughterhouse to go and see and experience what actually goes on behind closed doors. And if any of you have, I'm not going to go into any gruesome detail, but if any of you have seen any videos online about how animals are treated, I can assure you that it is as gruesome as it looks on the videos. I think there's a few terms like humane slaughter thrown around. I think that's an absolute load of rubbish, to be honest. I don't think that exists. My view from my experience is that the way animals are killed, there's nothing humane about that at all. And actually, I think the concept of humane slaughter is an oxymoron. It doesn't actually make sense. So, just to summarize, most people, again, want to be kind to animals, but because of all this harm, all this violence that goes on, that's why it's paradoxical. Okay, so people have this inconsistent sort of feeling that comes up in them because they both typically like animals and want to be kind to them, but also want to pay other people to kill them on their behalf. Another interesting part of this topic is that there's actually a good amount of research on the psychological impact of people who work in the slaughterhouse industry and who are involved in the killing floors and that sort of thing as well. And so, I mean, I've seen this myself from the people there, but the people who are working in slaughterhouses are pretty disadvantaged people, to sort of say the least. You know, they typically experience high levels of drug use and alcohol use, addiction. They have typically high levels of mental health problems, high levels of incarceration rates relative to the general population. In general, this is not a sort of overly well-to-do or lucky sort of subset of the population. They're pretty vulnerable sort of group of people. A lot of the research suggests that working in a slaughterhouse makes people, and actually that just the physical act of working in the slaughterhouse and being in there for days on end is itself quite a traumatic sort of thing. And from going in there for a few hours myself, I can only really imagine what sort of toll it would take on people's psyche to be in that sort of environment every day. But equally, people who are more likely to have experienced trauma before in their life are also more likely to end up in these sorts of jobs as well. So it's kind of like a double whammy for those people. Okay, so that was just a sort of crash course into the ethical consequences of eating meat, and I'm just going to very briefly talk about the environmental consequences as well. So I chose to include this study because it was the first study that looked at people's actual diets in terms of what they ate. There's a whole lot of research on hypothetically, the hypothetical impact of people's diets, but there isn't really many studies that actually looked at what people actually ate and took a food diary of what people actually ate and then looked at the environmental consequences or environmental impact of those particular types of food and those particular brands of food and quantities of food and that sort of thing as well. And so this study looks at that, which I think is quite cool. I'm going to cover 3 different impacts. The first one is carbon emissions. On this graph here, on the y-axis, you've just got the amount of carbon emissions, and the higher up the bar on the graph is the more carbon emissions from that diet. And then the 3 bars there, they refer to these 3 things here. So basically what they've got in the study is they've got about 50 people who are omnivores, so 50 people who eat meat, about 50 people who are vegetarians, and also about 50 people who are vegans. And they're looking at the impact of their actual diet for each of those groups. And that's what you can see there. The O represents omnivores, and then VG represents vegetarians, and the third bar represents vegans. As you can see, eating meat, in this study, eating meat causes much more pollution in terms of carbon emissions than both vegetarian and vegan diets. So same study, but looking at water use, you see the same effect. Omnivore diets, so eating meat, uses much more water in terms of litres per day than both vegetarian and vegan diets. Finally, looking at land use, so that's literally just like the area of land, like the amount of farmland that you need to produce the crops and that sort of thing to feed these people. You're using a lot more land use for an omnivore diet relative to vegetarian and vegan diets as well. Now, depending on the studies you look at, you'll see some different effects. Like in this study here, the vegetarian and vegan impacts, environmental impacts, are kind of similar. Other studies will show vegetarian diets as more impactful, negatively impactful than vegan diets. But again, it depends on how you measure the diet, and this study was actually looking at what people actually ate, not just hypothetically ate. If you're interested in that, you can ask me a question about that later. But the short of it is that there's a good amount of evidence, quite a good substantial amount of evidence, that meat-eating diets cause more negative impacts on the environment than both vegetarian and vegan diets. So then we can, and other people have asked, why is it that people do this? Because most people, again, I said most people tend to care about the earth and the environment to a greater or lesser degree, and most people care about animals. Why is it that people do this? And so researchers have simply just asked that, done a bunch of studies and asked people who eat meat, what is it that, why do you eat meat? And asking people to sort of reflect on and to think about what comes up when they're asked to sort of justify that behaviour of eating meat. And it just so happens that people typically come up with 4 sort of types of concepts, and they happen to all start with the letter N, which is why this research is called the 4 N's of meat-eating justifications. So typically people will say one of 4 things when asked about eating meat. They'll say that eating meat is natural. We've been doing it for thousands of years, so why would we need to stop? We've been doing it for ages. You've heard about these ideas of like the caveman diet and all these sorts of things. They'll say it's normal, that most people eat meat. Everyone in society does it, so why should I stop? Everyone does it, They'll say it's necessary. They'll say we've got to eat meat for health reasons, and if I don't eat meat, I might get sick or something like this. And they'll also say that meat tastes good, that's just the justification for why they do it. They actually just simply like eating meat. So there's a couple of things that come to mind when I think about this research. The first is I've got there in the bottom, that harming animals is not necessarily driven by prejudice. It's not like people are saying, I just love it when people go and kill animals, I just want to go and kill some animals. It's not what people say. when you ask people about eating meat, they often don't even talk about the animals. And what you find is there's a separation, this disconnect between animals and between meat. And a lot of the time, people will just respond with justifications or answers about meat instead of about the production or the harming of the animals. And I'm going to come back to this in another study later on about the differences between people who do, because the thing is some people do talk about wanting to kill animals and that sort of thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between people who explain their diet in terms of focusing on meat or focusing on the production and the harming of animals. And those two things are quite different, quite disconnected. So, sort of keeping with this theme of this disconnection between meat and with the production of meat, with harming animals and farming animals, there's a couple of things here to consider. The couple of things to consider. The first is this geographical distance, and that literally just means that the farming, in terms of the raising, but also the killing of animals, it goes on, as I've said in the title, out of sight. So it happens out in the countryside. And this is obviously partly for practical reasons, that if you want to farm animals, you need a big space. It's just for the same reason if you want to farm crops and farm vegetables, you need a lot of land. Land out in the countryside is a lot cheaper than land in the city. So it makes financial sense to farm out in the countryside. But that argument only makes sense for the raising of the animals. It doesn't hold for the killing of animals, because you could argue that if people really wanted to advocate for the production of eating meat and talk about how humane the slaughter is and how just wonderful this industry is, you could have butchers and perhaps slaughterhouses in cities to, it could be a marketing strategy. You could say, hey, look, there's this wonderful thing called killing animals. We want to show you all about it. It's going to be free advertising. When people are walking down the street, you can see some animals being killed and see how your meat is made. Using the slaughtering of animals on the high street, obviously, it's a bit of a joke. But what this points to is actually quite a serious point, that people who are involved in animal agriculture and the raising and killing of animals, they don't want the public to see the production. They want to keep it out of sight, and that is by design. And so, again, that example, that kind of silly example of the slaughterhouse on the high street, it just points to how much this industry wants to hide things from society.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, I feel really echoey. Okay, so we'll hold this thought. We'll come back to this. I think my talk does flow a little bit from Tom's, so bear with us if some of the stuff we're talking about here, we're now going to be revisiting again when we go back to looking at Tom's work. But what we really wanted to do is for Tom to give a kind of bigger picture overview of the research, what psychologists have to say about this topic. And then I've recently done quite a small-scale project, a bit of research with people, talking to them about their consumption of what we might call plant-based meat. So you probably know what plant-based meat is, even if you don't call it that. So veggie burgers, vegan burgers, sausages, mince, products that are plant-based but are designed to resemble meat in terms of the way that they taste, the way that they smell, the consumption cues, it looks like a burger. So I was really interested in going out and talking to a few people about how and why they use and eat plant-based meat. So we're going to kind of go from the bigger picture to honing in on a particular case study and example. So one of the things that was the starting point for my research really was thinking about the ways in which meat consumption practices are shifting, right? And Tom's going to talk a little bit about the kind of cultural normalization of meat, how meat is culturally embedded within our society. But we do know that actually people are eating less meat, particularly younger people. And I think dietary practices are less rigid. So actually one thing we didn't include in the poll there was, do we have any flexitarians in the room, for example, any climatarians? So there's these new kinds of dietary practices, and I think there's more fluidity between these different identities now. Interestingly, a big starting point for my study was, I think we need to move away from seeing not eating meat as a question of abstinence and avoidance. So we see a growing plant-based meat market. We see increasing amounts of plant-based substitutional products. So there's still lots of ways for us to engage with the market if we don't want to eat meat. And a couple of questions I wanted to think about through my study, if meat consumption is so culturally and socially embedded, why do some people abstain from meat? Why do some people reduce their meat consumption? And what kinds of values, beliefs, and identity work sustains this? What particular role does plant-based meat play? How does that support and sustain these kinds of practices and fill what I've been calling in my research the meat gap? The idea that we have to have something that meat plays a key role on the plate, right? Particularly in very uninspiring British cuisine when we've got vegetables, potatoes, and something else that takes that other space on the plate. So how do these products fill the meat gap? But importantly, and importantly for today, I think, what are some of the ethical and moral tensions around meat consumption, reduction, and or substitution? So I wanted to draw a lot from my data and really focus on that last question. And we're going to talk about the meat paradox and the 4 Ns and other things that Tom's touched on as well. So one of my participants talked about managing what they called the moral issue of meat. And I thought that phrase was really, really interesting. So I've kind of used that here. And a couple of the key strategies that my participants used were moderation, distancing, and necessity. So to follow on from what Tom was saying, I'm going to really hone in on these today through unpacking some quotes with you. I should say as well, I've used pseudonyms, and my participants were a range of meat eaters, vegans, vegetarians, pescatarians, and flexitarians. So this is a long quote, and you don't have to read it all, and I've highlighted some key things we're going to pull out here, but I think this really sets us up for looking at the rest of the data here. This really shows us that meat paradox in action that Tom was talking about. So Simon says here, I would struggle to kill an animal with my bare hands. He goes on to talk about briefly working in the meat industry, and he thinks it makes it hard to justify eating meat. He talks about barbaric industrial farming, for example, and working in this chicken farm. Then he pivots to talk about the environmental impact. It's a net negative, and back again to the slaughtering of animals. So here we can see both those elements of the meat paradox that Tom talked about. The concern with animal welfare, not wanting to harm animals, feeling that cruelty to animals does happen in the industry, but on the other side, the environmental impact as well. So the resolution, the way that Simon manages his meat consumption then, is through the strategy of moderation. So he says, I guess I have an overall moral code. It's impossible to live without damaging the world. So it's all about moderation. And if everyone ate meat once a week or even once a month, it would be better for the world, I think. So I can justify most things to myself, he says, if I play the moderation card. And then one thing I find really interesting in this extract is he kind of then compares meat to short-haul flights or car journeys, things that he thinks shouldn't really be done, but actually, if he does them in moderation, it kind of makes it okay. So it's interesting how we actually, towards the end of this quote, we move slightly away from the animal cruelty, animal welfare arguments and kind of really hone in on the environmental. We move towards comparing meat to short-haul flights and journeys in cars here. So this is a key strategy. Simon is one of my key participants who would eat a vegan or veggie burger once or twice a week, maybe. And he sees that, he explicitly says he sees that as a way to manage the moral issue of meat and justify some consumption. Other participants talked about this as well. And it wasn't just the meat eaters that grappled with these tensions. So Natalie is a pescatarian, and she says, again, she's grappling with this idea around animal cruelty. And one of the things that Tom has in his slides was thinking about something that we call attribution of mind to animals. To what extent do we attribute mind and sentience and the capacity to feel something to different animals? And some animals we attribute more mind to than others, right? We might think of cats and dogs quite differently to how we think of fish or insects or rodents. And here you can see that at play for Natalie a little bit. She thinks that it's hypocritical to be a pescatarian, and she's kind of acknowledging that it's cruel to eat fish, but it's still something that she does. So she's attributing mind in that way. And she says, again, similar to what Simon's arguing here, it was about taking a middle ground, making some steps, and really cutting the meat out. And again, that environmental impact coming through. And I guess overall in my data, actually, the environment was a stronger theme and a stronger motivator for meat reduction than animal welfare. And she says, that's how I justify still eating the other things. I'm doing some good. I'm trying. And another pescatarian, Grace, said, again, I feel that there are cruelties in the dairy industry, for example, but I'm doing what I can. I'm trying. I'm doing my best. And she actually said, I engage in this cognitive dissonance, so I disconnect from thinking too much about it. And other participants, you can see my flexitarians, perhaps unsurprisingly, they were perhaps the most likely to talk about, moving flexibly between eating meat and not eating meat and being conscious of what you're eating. So here Ian sort of jokes, we don't need everyone to be perfect vegans, but actually if we all just did that little bit, it would help. And Hazel, similarly, if people are just doing anything is good, isn't it? Just 1 day off, 2 days off a week, and starting to reconfigure and see meat as a treat. Tom, do you want to jump back in, or shall I just do my bit? Great. And actually, this flows really nicely from what Tom was talking about in terms of thinking about that disassociation and that distance as well. So a lot of my participants talked about basically the more processed meat is, or the less proximity or closeness it has to meat, the more comfortable they feel about eating it or kind of, engaging with it. So Olivia in particular talked a lot about her kind of feelings of disgust, very kind of visceral disgust towards a lot of meat. So here she says, anything with blood, with skin, with hair, if I see that, I'm not eating it, not on the bone. And here she says, which I thought was really interesting, almost like it's not meat. So the meat that she eats has to be somehow not like meat to her. And she gives the example of a chicken breast as something that isn't too much like meat, but she still tastes quite nice. So we can see a little bit of one of those four ends that Tom talked about as well. She does still go back to, it does taste nice. And then back to Simon, again, talking about the distancing that we have from meat. And he says, I think we should be comfortable with the death side of it. In the UK, you don't see a chicken's head if you're kind of walking through town, but in other places you might do. And it's just like Tom was saying, we don't really necessarily see highly visibly the kind of like, the animal behind our meat, if you like. And he's kind of touching on here that actually the queasiness of doing the killing and the blood is a reason to not eat so much meat. And then I wanted to build on, again, one of the four ends that Tom was talking about. So thinking particularly around one thing that came through really strongly and was a tension for a lot of my meat-eating participants was the necessity argument. That was probably the strongest argument they used for still eating some meat, There was some evidence of niceness, as we saw with that last quote, and also they talked about naturalness, but more critically. So, they would say, I want to reduce my meat consumption, but my family say, we've always eaten meat. We've got the teeth to eat meat. We should eat it. So they didn't really talk about the naturalness as much. But they definitely did talk about the necessity. So let's go back to Olivia. We talked in the last slide about how Olivia, there's quite a lot of meat she doesn't want to eat, right? She doesn't want bone, she doesn't want hair, she doesn't want skin. She said to me, if she has a steak, she wants it covered in peppercorn sauce so that she can't taste that it tastes like meat. But she still eats meat. And for her, a big part of this was around her partner's diet. So her partner went to the gym. Her partner was getting the gains, as she says here in this quote. And she talks about the vitamins that come with meat, the protein that comes with meat. So she says here, I don't want her to go without something that she needs. So again, that idea that meat is something that we need to have in our diet. Another example was Chris. So Chris here gives an example of being really tired, having low amounts of B12 vitamin, and then deciding that as a kind of way to address that, he needed to reintroduce more meat back into his diet. So this necessity argument was a barrier to people reducing their meat consumption, and/or it kind of caused lapses and for people to resume meat consumption. So he says, I think my body does need to eat meat to get the B12. And then he also talked about his partner being pregnant. And again, he was encouraging his partner to eat more meat during this period. So that's a little bit around kind of the strategies that meat eaters used, participants of all dietary practices used to rationalize their consumption, to explain and make sense of their reduction practices. But there were also some specific tensions that participants talked about when they talked about plant-based meat. And, I had a biased sample. So all my sample were people who already ate plant-based meats, right? I wanted to understand why and how people use them, rather than talk to people that didn't know about them or didn't engage with them. So I was particularly interested in how people use them, of a range of dietary practices. And these kinds of tensions came up. So all of my participants ate these products, found some benefit in these products, thought that they tasted good, that they added variety and texture to meals, that they filled the meat gap, for example. But some of the tensions that came through were really interesting. And perhaps one of the biggest ones, and maybe it comes as no surprise, was walking the line between something being enough like meat that it tastes good and you want to eat it, but not too much like meat. If anyone's ever tried the This Isn't Chicken Thighs, they walk the line. Even when you cook them, it feels very, very much like cooking meat. And Ashley really sums this up nicely. She says, you want something that tastes close to the real thing, but if it's too close, it's a bit gross. Or if it's trying but doesn't get there, that's also gross. And it could even vary on the type of meat, right? She wants her vegan burger to be very burgery. But with chicken, it's a bit more difficult. She says, you want to be like, yeah, fair enough, that's vegan chicken, but not like, oh my God, that's really real chicken. So I love this expression that she uses here, the strange little sweet spot. And of course, understandably, that could be different for different participants and people that I spoke to. And for the meat eaters, the desire for products to resemble meat was unsurprisingly stronger. And those who didn't eat meat were more wary or apprehensive of products that resembled meat too strongly. So a lot of the vegetarians, vegans, and pescatarians talked about products that look like they have fake blood, for example, like a juicy steak would be a no for them. There'd be a line, they wouldn't try that product. But perhaps what I think is the most interesting tension here is, do plant-based meats ultimately actually just reinforce the centrality and status of meat in our diets? So it's almost like we're trying to substitute something out and replace meat with these other products. But actually, the problematic issue potentially here is through doing so, we are reinforcing meat status and position. And I love this quote from Grace, or this phrase here. She says, you're taking meat as the benchmark. So you're making something that isn't meat, but you're saying it has to look like meat, taste like meat, and serve the same purpose as meat. And if we were moving away from meat completely, we wouldn't be doing this. So this really interesting tension around, these products could be positive, they could help people to reduce their meat consumption if that's what they want to do, but at the same time, they don't really do anything to challenge how central meat is in our culture. And not all participants said this. Some did say, no, I think these products are a great way to transition away from meat, and they do challenge the central position of meat in our diets. And Debbie was more along Grace's lines. She talked throughout the interview about plant-based meats as being looky-likeys. And she said it normalizes meat consumption. It says to have a healthy diet, you have to have something that looks, tastes, even behaves like meat. So these tensions here, as I say, around just reinforcing, the status of meat. Are we really filling the meat gap if we're just filling it with something that resembles meat so closely? We're not, and some participants, talk, can we not think more outside the box in terms of what we're eating instead of meat? And then the final tension here, and it circles back to what I talked about at the start. So Simon, for example, talking about moderation as a strategy. Pretty much all of my participants who ate meat talked about moderation, reduction, balance. And Hope here, who's a vegetarian, argues that these products are very much targeted at meat eaters. In fact, all of my participants said that. They felt that veggie burgers, vegan burgers were mostly aimed at meat eaters rather than vegetarians and vegans, which is interesting because we know a lot of people who are vegetarian and vegan do still eat those products. But she said the image here that's developing through these products is the canny meat eater who's doing their bit for the environment by swapping stuff out. She says it's taken the guilt away from eating meat. You can be a meat eater, but just sometimes swap it for this plant alternative, and then good job, you're doing your bit or doing a bit. And this language of doing your bit was very common in the data, actually. A lot of participants used that that terminology to say, I'm doing my bit through eating these products. But Hope was not really on board with that. And she says, it's apologist, it's a way, it's taking the guilt out, it's making excuses. Okay, so key sort of takeaways from my data, really. As I said, this idea of doing one's bit or even managing a moral issue of meat through making these changes, making these swaps, but without bigger dietary and lifestyle changes. And don't get me wrong, substitution can support a transition away from meat. It can help us to eat less meat. We know that meat is damaging for the environment, and it's good for people, arguably, to have choice, flexibility, hybridity, and in how and what they consume. So these can be really positive developments, and I'm not taking away from the kinds of positives, certainly that my participants raised in terms of plant-based meat. But the kind of key point to take away and think about, particularly if you guys, I don't know, we didn't ask that in our poll, but I don't know if people eat plant-based meat, but, does this growing market and this move towards these products actually come at the expense of ultimately reinforcing the status of meat? That's all from me. I'll hand back over to Tom. Feeling better?
Thank you so much for that. Thanks everyone for your patience before I had to leave, and obviously thank you so much, Emily, for jumping in there. That was not to plan. Yes, that was a swig of cough syrup, so okay. I will just jump back to kind of where I was. I think what I'm going to probably do is just do about 15 minutes and we'll just see where we get to, and then we'll jump to Q&A and still have some time for that. I think that should work out good. So I was somewhere around here. So where was I? So I talked a bit about the geographical distance, and then what I'm going to talk about now is a few studies on what we can call the psychological distance. And really by that I just mean how we think about other animals' minds. And by minds I mean just the same way we think about other people's minds in terms of their personality, their intelligence, how warm they are, and that sort of thing. And there's a good amount of research on basically the sorts of minds that people attribute to animals. And the summary of it is, and I'll talk about a few studies of this, but the summary of it is that the way people think about animals' minds, psychologists will call this motivated cognition. So what this means is that it's not that we all have a very accurate understanding of exactly how intelligent a fish is or exactly how intelligent a pig is or a chicken is, but what happens is that we kind of change our views, or people who harm animals and eat meat change their views about what they think animals experience and their consciousness and their personalities and what sort of capacity they have to suffer. That changes as a function of how much people harm and exploit them. So there's an interesting relationship between mind and harm. So let me just go through a couple of studies about this. So this is a pretty typical social psychology experiment. What you have here is, they've got 66 meters, so they've gotten participants and brought them into the lab, about 66 people. 43 female, and the average age of participants about 20 years old. So this is typical university student sample. And they've got this group of people, and they're going to split them into two groups, and they're going to show them two different types of the experiment, and they're going to ask the participants some questions, and what they're going to do is see whether or not the type of condition they were in, and I'll talk about that in a second, but to see what type of condition they were in, if that had an impact on the thing that they're interested in measuring. In this case, the thing that the researchers are interested in measuring is mind attribution, which is just what I was talking about. And this measure of mind attribution, you can just think of it like a general measure of how intelligent, sophisticated, warm, and what sort of personality people think these animals have. Okay, so that's just like the dependent measure. So I'm going to come back to what these two conditions are then. So we've got people into the lab, split them into two groups. The first group sees this picture of a lamb and reads a little story about it. This lamb will be taken to an abattoir, killed, butchered, and sent to supermarkets as meat products for humans. So this is the food condition. The rest of the participants see a different condition, and they read a different scenario. They see the same picture, but read a different thing, and what they read is this non-food condition. So they read, this lamb will be moved to other paddocks and will spend most of its time eating grass with other lambs. And the design is really that simple, that people are just reading a different thing and then they're measuring the same thing to see whether or not how animals are described as either food or not as food, to see whether that changes how people think about those animals. And sure enough, what they find is that, yeah, it does actually have an impact. So this is the results here. On the y-axis, which is the line going up the top there, they've got that measure of mind attribution. That's like how much, you can think of that like how intelligent or how much personality people think the animals have, and higher numbers there equal like more intelligence, more personality, and that sort of thing. On the x-axis here, you've got the two different conditions, and they've got this is the average of each of the conditions. So it's an average score of mind attribution for each of the two conditions. So the light grey box is the food condition here, and the dark grey box is the non-food condition here. So as you can see, people in the non-food condition think of the animals as having a higher capacity for mind, think of them as a bit more intelligent. And when people are shown a picture of a lamb and it's described as food, people diminish the amount of mind that they think it has. And again, this illustrates that this motivated cognition, that people think about animals, oh, not again. Oh. Sorry. Am I going to be able to do this? I don't know.
Do you want me to just do your slides? Just make good slides. Probably wing it. Need me to.
I will try, and if I die again, then maybe.
If you die, if you didn't, I will take over.
Okay. So as quick as I can. This is another study looking at an experiment looking at different ways of describing animals and measuring the impact of that on what people think about animals. There are 4 conditions. In this study, the researchers are describing a fictional animal, so a fake animal, that they call the Bennett's tree kangaroo. So kangaroos hop around in the grass, they don't live in trees. And so they're just describing this fictional animal. What's important is, again, just describing it. Are they describing it? I'm sorry. Are they describing it in terms of being just an animal, or are they describing it as a food animal? And you find the same thing. So they've got these 4 different conditions. The first condition, they're just describing the animal, just saying, here's this tree kangaroo. It lives in a tree and hops around in a tree. That's this one. In this condition, they say, here's this tree kangaroo, hops around in a tree, but actually it fell out of the tree and died. So it's dead in this condition. That's this condition here. In this condition, the collective food, they say, is a little tree kangaroo, hops around a tree, fell out of the tree and died, and some people ate it. So there's a difference there. It's about it getting eaten. In this condition, they're saying there's a tree kangaroo, and some people hunted and killed the animal and ate it. So there's a few different things going on there. Sometimes the animal dies in those 3 conditions, and there's one condition the animal lives. And then sometimes the animal is described as food, which is these 2 conditions with these smaller bars. In these conditions here, the animal is not described as food. What you've got on the y-axis is a measure of how much the tree kangaroo would suffer if harmed. So it's measuring this fake tree kangaroo's ability to suffer. As you can see, same sort of effect as before. When the animal is described as food, again, it's a fictional animal, and people are just randomly reading these different scenarios about a fictional animal. But just simply describing an animal as food, that people eat it, changes how people think about the animal. And people think that the animal, for these 2 groups here, suffers less when they hear about people eating it. Okay, so again, it's that motivated cognition to basically justify harming it. I talked a lot about the meat paradox and people feeling this sort of tension about harming animals but wanting to like animals as well. And so diminishing the mind of animals, and this is true for humans as well, diminishing the mind for animals alleviates some of that guilt, makes people feel a little bit better, a little bit less bad about harming those animals. I'm going to just jump ahead because I'm not going to be able to do this all. So to come back to some of these things I was talking about before, to sort of summarize, I've talked at the start about how violent and harmful the animal agriculture industry is, that to eat meat, you have to, by definition, kill animals. And the way that animals are killed is pretty violent and grotesque. And I said that I have also seen this for myself firsthand as well. So, but the thing is that most people who eat meat are wonderful, lovely people, just like people who don't eat meat. It's not like bad people eat meat and good people are vegetarian and vegan. That's not how the world is. So why is this? Why does it happen? And why do all these good, wonderful, lovely people eat meat and contribute to this like really violent, horrible sort of industry? The first thing to think about is that, again, coming back to those sort of justifications, that's partly that meat tastes good and people like it, but it's also very reinforcing on a very basic kind of level, that meat is very high in calories, and so you're getting a lot of sustenance. If you sort of forget about the morality side of it, and if you just think about it as calories, it is high in calories. So from a very primal sort of perspective, it's reinforcing in the sense that people will be more likely to eat that meat if it's very high in calories relative to some other things that are lower in calories. You have to eat a lot more of them to get that sort of sustenance. Okay. Again, I'm not talking about the ethics of it, but just talking about the calories. So that's one point. The other thing why people still eat meat, even though it causes all this sort of violence and suffering, is that for most people, they grow up eating meat. And this is one of the interesting things, is that most people, the vast majority of people, don't actually choose to eat meat. They're given it by their parents, and they don't actually have a say in it until they're older. And so when people reflect on things, most people, like myself, most teenagers, don't think very much beyond themselves. And it's not until people are sort of in their around 20 years old, approximately, it varies, but around 20 years old, that people really start to reflect on and develop their own sense of morality and their own sense of what's right and wrong, and to think for themselves and to question society's values and norms. And so for a lot of people, when they find out that eating meat, this thing that we all do, typically, most people, even most vegans and vegetarians, grow up eating meat. So for most people in the UK, they've been doing this thing, contributing to this like violent industry for so long, for their whole life. It's a lot to deal with, and just on a really basic kind of level, it's a lot of information to sort of come to terms with. And so that is an important thing to think about, to understand. It's also, when people think about eating meat, it's also associated with lots of positive things. So like I talked about this, connection or disconnection between the product and the production. And in reality, that is where meat comes from. There's no two ways about it. But for most people, they don't have an association between meat and violence and harm. They have an association between meat and having a Sunday roast with their family. They have an association with Christmas, when they think about festivals and families, and they think of lots of wonderful, nice things. And for many people, they don't actually even think about animals at all. And so that's why it's kind of hard to change people's attitudes towards this. And that's why there's a lot of sort of, a little bit of animosity in society, and conversations and the dialogue and the discussions around the topic. So I said at the start, and I talked about these like 4 ends of meat eating justifications, and Emily also wonderfully included her own research on the topic as well, which is super interesting. There's some more recent research looking at a more nuanced way of looking at how people justify eating meat. So the 4 ends of meat eating justifications, that eating meat is natural, normal, necessary, and nice. That was some of the more original sort of research on it. But more recently, they've done this new measure called the carnism inventory, which is just carnism coming from the word carnivore. And they've measured a couple of different things. The first thing they've measured is what they called, and this is like, I've got 300 students describing their diet, 86% omnivore, and that sort of thing. What they were doing in this study was actually developing a scale. It's not too important for today. But they were just developing a new scale of how you measure people's attitudes towards eating meat and why people eat meat. So they found this, what they call carnistic defense, which is pretty similar to 4 ends, right? So humans should continue to eat meat because we've been doing it for thousands of years. Eating meat's better for my health, same sorts of things as the 4 ends, okay? I've been eating meat my whole life, I can never give it up. So we kind of already know this sort of stuff from the forens before, but they introduced this new concept called carnistic dominance. Now this, if you see, legitimates, I don't even know if legitimates is a word, but it legitimizes the practice of killing animals. And so note that the bottom one, that dominance, that's about animals, whereas the above one, about defense, that's about meat. And so remember, there's quite a difference in the psychological profile of people who justify eating meat versus justify killing animals, okay? So some people, when you ask them, some people say because basically what they'll do in a study like this is they'll give you a bunch of questions like this, and they'll say, how much do you agree with this question or not? Do you agree with it a lot, or do you disagree? And then the same for each of the questions. And what you find is that some people do agree with these questions. Like some people do think that animals are dirty and deserve to be eaten. There's a little bit of aggression in that sort of answering that question. Not eating animals is a sign of weakness. Some people think this. I have the right to kill any animal I want. Again, there's this sort of, I get the sense of aggression coming through here. Some people think animals aren't intelligent enough to suffer in intensive confinement. So again, you're getting a different sort of psychological profile of people who believe in this directly justifying harming and killing animals versus eating meat. I don't have time to go into it today, but there's actually quite a bit of research in psychology looking at the overlap between how people think about animals and how people think about people. And so what you find, again, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but what you find is that people who justify killing animals and really are quite sort of aggressive and justify that sort of treatment, they're also more aggressive and justify harming humans. And so they're also more likely to be sexist and have sexist views towards women and misogynistic views. They're also typically more likely to be, and this is not my research, there's quite a bit of other people's research on this, they're also typically more likely to be racist, to have negative views towards immigrants, refugees, homeless people, drug addicts, and the list goes on. But again, that's not all meat eaters. I'm just saying that's a sort of certain subtype of meat eaters. And the field of human-animal relations and how it relates to other human forms of prejudice is it's a growing sort of field, but it's a decent sort of topic. But it's beyond the scope of this introductory class. It's the sort of stuff I get into with my students when we have multiple seminars to get into more of these topics. But if you have questions about it, you're welcome to ask questions at the end. So then, I've talked about how people navigate the meat paradox by denying animals' minds, and those two studies I talked about how people change their attitudes, they have this motivated cognition towards animals, and they reduce the amount of mind attribution to animals to justify harming them. But there's another, perhaps a bit more simple way of resolving the meat paradox, and that's just not engaging with that behavior anymore. And so for vegetarians and vegans, they've decided usually to kind of resolve the meat paradox, that in this paradoxical because it requires good people to harm animals. See a wrong thing. So just going to have a brief summary slide of vegetarians and vegans. Because so vegetarians, they don't eat meat or fish, but they typically still eat animal products in the sense of things like dairy, butter, eggs, and things like that. So vegetarians typically don't eat meat. Just a fun sort of fact, India is the country with the most vegetarians in the world. About 30 to 40% of people in India are vegetarian. And so if you think of India as having well over 1 billion people, there's something like 500 million, roughly, vegetarians in India, which is just way more than any other country. It sort of stands out. It's really cool. Most UK vegetarians, but also people just in the West, most vegetarians are women, same with veganism as well. About 2/3 are women and about 1/3 are men. More likely to be university educated and left-wing, and there's also, again, quite a bit of research looking at like political orientation and eating meat, and typically people who are more right-wing tend to consume more meat, and people who are more left-wing typically tend to consume less meat. People who are vegetarian and vegan also more likely to be atheists and more likely to not be religious. And approximately 4 to 6%, it's tough to get good numbers on this, but around about 4 to 6% of people in the UK are vegetarian. So we can contrast this with veganism. So vegans abstain from eating and consuming all animal products, and they're different from vegetarians in that they don't eat meat, but they also don't eat eggs and dairy, so they don't eat things like butter and cheese and milk and stuff like that. Quite a few reasons here why people end up going vegan. There's for compassion. to support non-violence, that often people will describe being vegan for animals, for the planet, and also for people, for obviously a variety of reasons, which I talked about today. Most vegans also don't buy or wear animal materials like wool, fur, leather, and feathers as well. And approximately 1 to 3% of the UK population is vegan. The numbers on that are a little bit difficult. There isn't really any reliable evidence of the exact numbers of vegetarians and vegans, but this is the best approximation I could find. So I've got a little study here looking at the reasons why people become vegan. And so what you can see here on the top right is this light purple box is the original reasons why people went vegan, and then the dark box there is the current reasons why people went vegan. So as you can see, the top ones, the top points there, I don't want to eat animals or animal products, and thinking that the way that animals are farmed is cruel, those are the biggest reasons why people both turn to veganism and also why they stay vegan. Environmental reasons, interestingly, not as much of a reason why people become vegan, but it's a big reason, about 80% why people stay vegan. Even less people become vegan for health reasons. According to this study, only about a quarter of people became vegan for health reasons, but approximately just over a third stay vegan for health reasons. And then a very small percentage, as you can see, only around 5% of people are vegan because they were brought up vegan or vegetarian, or because someone encouraged them to do it. So for most people, for most vegans, it's typically about the ethical reasons why they go vegan. So that, thankfully, and you'll be pleased to know, brings us to the end of my very disruptive lecture. So thanks for your patience. We do have plenty of time for questions. So what I'm going to do is, we have Vlad, if you mind, would you like the microphone? Vlad here is from the University Veg Society, and he's going to briefly talk about some plant-based university initiative, and then after this we will move to the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Hello everybody, can you hear me? Hi, so I'm Vlad, I'm from the Vegan Society, and it's a society at the University of York if you're interested to join and learn more. And so that's more to do with the ethics side of things. And when it comes to the environmental aspects of eating plant-based, there's also something called the Plant-Based Universities Campaign. It's an international campaign run by students. So there's different groups at different universities across the UK. We have some campaigns in Europe as well. And there's one at York. There's a few of us in the room today. And yeah, so our campaign is focused on the environmental aspects of plant-based catering on campus, on university campuses. And our ask is for the university to switch to 100% plant-based catering to address the climate and ecological crises. And a few statistics to kind of cement why we're asking this. And we recently launched a petition to gain more support from students and staff. And if you're interested, you can scan our QR code. There's also just one leaflet on the table if you would rather do that at the end. And we also will have a screening on the 18th of March to further talk about the the damaging environmental impact of animal agriculture. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vlad. That's wonderful.
Do you want to keep? I'm really loud. So do you want to keep the mic? I am loud. I just am. Thank you, everyone, and thanks so much for bearing with us. We'll do we'll do the Menti as well. I forgot we had the Menti. Yeah. So if people want to ask us questions, put your hand up and ask us questions, please do so. But we know that not everyone always feels comfortable asking something, out loud. So feel free to also go back on the Menti, type your questions or comments up there. I'd be really interested to hear what you thought. I hope it's been interesting, provocative. Good question, Matt.
I just have a quick question about the study you talked about on parasitic dominance.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the strong feeling of entitlement schemes that were prevalent.
Yes.
That you talked about. I just wondered if that study was skewed by kind of the geographical demographic. I wonder
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the question was basically asking, if I'm correct, like, was there an association with political orientation and the subscales in the study that I showed you before? Yeah, there is. So it does correlate pretty well with political orientation, such that people who are more conservative are quite more likely to agree with the carnistic dominance subscale. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so actually I have many questions, but I don't have this time, so just pick up some. So just a quick remark and a question, okay?
Sure.
The remark is, when you presented the kind of, the species of animals that people eat in the UK, you included many species among the umbrella of fish, but you know, there's tuna fish and salmon.
Yeah.
And just as you wouldn't say mammals to describe, you know, pigs and cows
Sure.
and sheep, so I don't see why, you know, not including many species of fish under the, why not detailing the species of fish? Because many times people tend to, you know, just describe fish in this general way. This is also something that vegans do. I don't, it's not to blame you in any way, just to keep in mind the individual and group different between different individuals.
Shall I just quickly summarise that back in case?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point around how, even in our slides, it was interesting how we differentiated between different mammals. So we talked about people in the UK eat sheep, we eat pigs, we eat chicken, but we still talked about fish as a kind of homogenous category. And I think that speaks to something interesting about attribution of mind, right? And about thinking about the ways in which even we think about hierarchies of animals. And you're right, I think, you know, I think people have different fish that they would or wouldn't eat even. So yeah, thank you. Really good point.
So that's a quick one. And just a quick question.
Sure.
Regarding the health concerns. Some people, justified meat by saying they need it for health concern. The thing is, when I talk to these people, they always have the first person authority, and I mean specifically epistemic authority, meaning authority of knowledge. They know their health the best. They know the best how they feel. You know, it's like someone going to the doctor. The patient always have the first person authority. So the doctor can say, oh, I cannot diagnose you. I see nothing in your diagnosis which is bad or indicating disease. But then the patient say, I'm still in pain. And the patient will always be right about their pain. So by analogy, the meat eaters will always be right about how consumption of animal products make them feel.
Yeah.
So the thing I mostly do when I speak with such people is just approving and affirming the strategy of eating less or eating as few as you feel you need. So I wanted to ask you the kind of a general question, like what do you think about this strategy of affirmation and any other insights of how to deal with this kind of issue?
Your research speaks well to this.
So the question was around, I guess, kind of acknowledging that, I mean, as a sociologist, I love this, acknowledging people's lived experiences and their realities, and that, for example, if people eat meat, they are the best person to speak about, you know, their consumption and how it makes them feel. Just the same way if someone goes to the doctors, we respect, you know, or should respect their lived experience of their body, their pain. It's a bit like my participant Chris talked about his low B12 levels and eating more meat making him feel better again. So yeah, the question was kind of around how do we, I don't know, manage that, and do we like affirm that? And I guess one thing we wanted to do today, we wanted to get everyone in the room here because we think you're interested in this topic. It certainly wasn't to say that we think we want to be prescriptive or we want to say this is how we think people should eat or shouldn't eat. It was just kind of opening up a space for discussion, really. And yeah, I think eating it's highly personal, it's highly cultural, it's highly social, and I think it is difficult to navigate if you want to speak to someone about their dietary practices and whether they might want to eat less meat or stop eating meat completely. So I think it's an individual kind of management and engagement, really, isn't it? And I think if you are someone who is passionate about advocating reduced consumption of meat or encouraging people to stop eating meat, I think maybe it's about negotiating and meeting someone where they're at and feeling out the best way to interact with that person. You know, people can get understandably very, very defensive about these practices that are very kind of personal to us. So yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
I'm just mindful there were questions before me, so I'm happy to
Well, should we take one more in person and then
We will get to these,
A
yeah.
few on the slide, yeah.
I didn't want to skip.
No.
So I'm a vegetarian, so I'm sympathetic to those kind of viewpoints, but it can be quite difficult to tie into that speaking to people that don't share the kind of feelings that I have around meat. But one of the kind of best, I guess, summaries of why someone doesn't eat meat and might not convince anybody was just to me animals aren't food. And it's almost like a kind of phenomenological kind of response, because it's like that doesn't look or feel like food to me. And I just wondered if any of that came through in your data, where people were just like, it's just not food, I don't see it as food, so I don't want to eat it.
Yeah, really good question. So the question was around, one way that we might, I guess it's that disassociation thing, and is for vegetarians or vegans, one way of managing the thing of not eating meat is around just kind of, a cognitive shift in how we see animals, and just the fundamentally not seeing animals as food. And yeah, absolutely, in my data, vegans and vegetarians talked about that quite a lot. They talked about meat is a dead animal, or one participant said, I don't like to kiss my partner when he's had meat because he has a corpse in his mouth. So the language that they used was not just not associating animals with meat, but quite evocative, quite powerful language, like corpse, dead animal flesh, for example. So yeah, there was definitely evidence of that in the data. And obviously for the meat eaters and the flexitarians, it was more complex, because they were eating plant-based meat for a reason, usually because they wanted to reduce meat intake, but managing that alongside continuing to eat some meat. Should we jump out? I don't know if there's any that jump out. We probably won't be able to get through them all. But
So the first one, if we have time, I can show you the slide that I skipped. I'm very happy to show at the end. It can definitely stay at the end.
anything jumping out?
So I'm just reading this middle one. So someone said, I'm researching the impact of a university caterer swapping to entirely plant-based catering. Do you think practices like this could support a swap to plant-based diets, or cause, I'm guessing, maybe like pushback?
Gosh, yeah.
I mean, I think it sounds good. I think it's a good idea, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because, as we were saying, it's such a personal issue, and I think when people feel they don't have a choice, that's when it gets difficult. So I think some of the resistance to maybe a plant-based university, even though it might feel like good in principle, is feeling not having a choice. But I think generally that I think it's a positive. I think if we can speak to our own experiences, I think it's a really, really positive move. And as long as people can feel that they're catered for, yeah. See if we've got any. Yeah, that's a really good question. The question about how do vegetarians justify their ethics? And there was definitely a lot going on in my data here with the vegetarians and the pescatarians, even more so perhaps, as we saw with the quote from Natalie. She said, I think it is cruel to eat fish. I think I'm hypocritical, but I eat fish. And I touched on one of the other participants who talked about, she literally used the phrase cognitive dissonance. So she said, I feel that the dairy industry is as harmful as the meat industry, but I disconnect from it. I try not to think about it. And a big motivation was that my participants felt it was much, much easier to be vegetarian than vegan. So that kind of practicality trumped ethics in a lot of ways for my participants. It felt like a much, much bigger step to not eat dairy. There was some element of not wanting to inconvenience friends and families, and vegetarian being a bit easier. Plant-based cheese got a lot of bad press in my interviews as well, whereas I think plant-based meat has really progressed to a level where people can enjoy it, and it does, I think that's part of it, is that these substitute products in some ways, we haven't seen parallel developments with, meat with replacement milks. I mean, milks are pretty good, but replacement cheese, for example. So there was tension there, and I think my participants did acknowledge that tension, but sometimes it came back to practicalities and taste. One of the four N's. Things are nice. I could never give up cheese was a common phrase. Cheese is nice. So I think that's the kind of way some of my participants talked about those tensions. Maybe you take a
No, that's good. No, that's good.
Tom, if you're not feeling too.
Good question. So is it not conceivable that humans are naturally prone to and will continue to choose to turn a blind eye to the effects just as they do? I mean, in short, yeah. Yeah. The turning a blind eye and the sort of being able to kind of switch off empathy and mind attribution, stuff like that, my own view is that it's not always bad. It might sound a little bit controversial, but it's actually, if you imagine what it would be like to have empathy for everyone around you all of the time, that would be so exhausting, right? And so it's actually quite adaptive to be able to switch off your empathy or turn down your empathy and your mind attribution and what you're thinking about other people. The only trouble is that some people turn it right down, or some people always turn it down, and that sort of thing, and people can, it depends on how people use it. So it's like an adaptive, the ability to like mentally switch off from other people, I think is a healthy thing. We need that. We need to be able to have that. But it's just that ability has pros and cons, and the cons of it is the way we can switch off to animals, but also how do we switch off to people and the suffering of other people as well.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, many of my participants in the study, the environment was a key motivation for meat reduction. Interestingly, and it really aligns with that study that Tom showed, a lot of my vegetarians and vegans said, I originally went vegan or vegetarian for animal welfare reasons, but it's become increasingly about the environment because we cannot hide from it anymore. We cannot switch off from it. We are living through the climate crisis. But actually, I also saw a degree of what we might call ecological fatalism in my data. So people saying, what can I do? Oh, I can stop eating meat, but no one else is stopping eating meat, or I can stop flying. And one participant, it was quite a nice image, he said, I'm just sat there washing out my yogurt pots for the recycling while all these factories exist in China. And I'm thinking, what can I do? What difference can I make? So I think there's a sense that these things are so overwhelming, and I strongly do think that we need to move way beyond individual action, and I think that there's a risk of this kind of individual responsibilization, if we just eat a bit less meat, or if we just wash out our yogurt pots and make sure we recycle them, we can make a difference, and it does shift responsibility away from corporations and ultimately from late-stage capitalism and the really damaging environmental effects of our wider social and political system. That was a bit heavy, sorry.
Very well said.
Clear to get that in there.
Look, I think we have a lot of questions. Let's say that I'm happy to answer all questions. I'm happy to stay here and answer the questions, okay? If some people might need to go for other things. What I'm going to propose is that... No, hold on.
No, I think it's the campus vegan sausage rolls.
Oh, okay.
Not used.
I'm all about the Greg's sausage rolls. Greg's sausage rolls.
They are good, yeah.
So if it's okay with Emily, what I want to do is ask you a couple of questions for some feedback about the lecture, and just a couple of questions on Menti, and then I will stay in the room and answer all the questions. But I'll just ask for you to get some feedback about the lecture, and then basically what this means is that anyone who wants to go and doesn't want to listen to me and Emily answer all the questions can actually go. So let's just, if you don't mind, again, I'll come back to all those questions, but if you don't mind...
I don't mind.
As a result of the talk, do you plan to take any of these actions? And you can just have a little think and answer these questions. This is encouraging. This is really wonderful. Yeah.
We didn't have a political agenda, but it's interesting to think about. Have we got people thinking about things? I think we have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Well, thank you for answering this. We really appreciate it, and it's just useful to know. I don't know about you, but yeah. So this is my first time giving a public lecture, inviting the public to come in. I've really enjoyed it, despite the coughing fit. I really appreciate having people coming in and listening, and it's really nice to know that it's had some sort of impact on you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will. I know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the results here. So. We want you to be honest and tell us what you think, but I'm not going to show the results here. So you, obviously, be kind, please. But
I thought we had to show them. And I spent this whole time sitting there thinking it was going to be awful at the end when all the comments were on the screen.
Nah, we'll just look at it later. We'll look at it later.
But Yeah, but, and like we say, I mean, I know it's hard hitting doing something on an evening. I don't think
Yeah.
I even really wanted to do something on an evening after I'd been in a 2-hour committee meeting this afternoon. But
Yeah.
we really appreciate everyone
Yeah.
coming out, and great to see members of the public and students in the room as well.
Yeah.
And we've really enjoyed having the opportunity to share some of our research and
Yeah,
thoughts with you.
It's been really cool. I was just speaking to a member of staff before, and it's very reassuring this many people are interested in this topic, because we have lectures in the psychology department each week, and apparently about double the amount of people have come today than usually come to the department lectures, which I think is really cool. So thank you very much for coming. Yes, so if you want to run and leave, you're welcome to. But if you want to stay and listen to the questions, I will stay, and I'm happy to stay for another 10, 20 minutes and go through the questions with you. So I'll let people leave if they want to, and then we'll go back to the questions.
No, I'm good.
Okay, so let me go with this first one here. So someone said, what would be the psychological reasons for people who are raised by vegetarian parents opted out from being vegetarian? I mean, that's a really good question. The honest answer is there'll probably be a variety of different reasons, and some of it will be to do with. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say, because it's a sort of a personal sort of thing. It's an interesting question. If the person wants to know that, you can email me and I'll send you a research paper on it if you want. But it'll basically... Oh, do you have an answer?
I was just thinking, because our parents are such a key influence on our early dietary practices, but actually so is society as a whole. So I can imagine growing up in a vegan or I don't know what the research says about it, but you're kind of pushing back against a cultural norm, right? So it's understandable perhaps that when someone, I don't know, goes to school or, gets out of the kind of early years home environment, that actually these cultural norms around eating meat are more powerful than the kind of parental norms. So I think that might explain some of it. Like you had that slide about, how eating meat is so culturally embedded and it's such a norm that we take for granted, that I think that maybe can have an influence that can be more powerful than parental influence potentially. That would be one thing if I was going to hypothesize, I would say that would be part of it. I mean, peer pressure might be too strong a word, but again, just the kind of pressures and expectations, wanting to fit in. A lot of my participants talked about fitting in, wanting to feel included, wanting to feel part of celebrations and birthdays and rituals and barbecues and Christmas, and so it might be about feeling socially that you fit in with your friends and your peer group as well. I think could play a part.
I should have let you answer first, sorry.
Oh, no, don't worry, I don't mind. Then we've got, I think, I don't know much about lab-grown meat.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, I don't know either.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I don't know very much about lab-grown meat, but I think there are potentially tensions around using an initial animal sample, for example, or meat sample to generate lab-grown meat. So again, it's about thinking about the ethics of that. Do we think that that's okay? Would we only eat lab-grown meat if it was entirely generated without use of any meat or animal products? My participants in my study varied quite a lot. Some of them were really up for lab-based meats, some of them weren't. I think one of the real barriers to plant-based meats was around their unnatural. It's Franken meat. What is pea protein, they would say. Meat is natural, organic, local. Plant-based meat is made in a lab, it's fake, it's plasticky, it's hyper-processed. So I think that cultured and lab-grown meat would probably run into those same barriers, right? It would be seen potentially as highly processed, artificial, not natural. So, and I don't know about acceptable, but in terms of whether it would be widely publicly accepted, I think it would have similar challenges to plant-based meats in that people would be deterred by the idea that these are unnatural or artificial in some way.
I thought I could answer like this and this together.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that all right?
Yeah.
So,
Oh, the insects, there were quite a few questions about
Okay.
insects. So I don't know
well,
about insects.
I don't really know anything about insects. Watch me pretend. So the slide. So someone asked about the slide that I missed. Pretty sure it was this one. So this is. I've talked a bit about mind, like you can think about that in terms of personality, intelligence, that sort of thing. Same sort of thing for people, but we can think about the sort of minds and personalities that animals have. This is a study looking at the relationship between how edible people think different species are and how, if you want, intelligent or how mindful they think other species are. And I've just got a few different pictures up there to just illustrate some of the species because I recognise the font is a bit small, so it's kind of hard to read. So what you've got on the y-axis is edibility, and so that's just measured in terms of questions like, would you choose to eat this animal? Would you eat this animal if asked to? And they've just got an average score for participants on how edible they think the different species are. And then the participants ask how intelligent and sophisticated and da-da-da. These measures in terms of both emotions and cognition. So basically, you can sort of summarize mind attribution in terms of these two aspects of emotionality and cognition, basically like having the capacity for emotion and the capacity for cognition, with higher levels of those seen as having more mind and lower levels of those being thinking of others as having less mind. So I've created this composite score